They called him the man who had everything. Mansions on 3 continents, cars that cost more than entire houses, and women who competed for his attention. But in a hospital corridor in Rome, a blind woman was about to save his grandmother's life and teach him that true vision has nothing to do with eyes. This is the story of how Marcus Sterling discovered that sometimes we need to lose our sight to gain perspective. The Italian morning sun bathed the Hotel Belmond Villa San Martino as Marcus Sterling adjusted his Patek Philippe, watching his grandmother Catherine prepare for another day of sightseeing. At 32, Marcus had inherited not only the family's oil fortune, but also an emptiness that no amount of money could fill. His iPhone buzzed with an urgent call from New York. Marcus answered with that icy voice he had perfected in Manhattan boardrooms. "I don't care if Davidson has 3 kids, Morrison. Numbers don't lie. Fire him today." His voice cut like a steel blade. As he ended a man's career with the same ease, he would choose a tie. "Sentimentality doesn't pay dividends. I want the papers on my desk by 5. Catherine watched from her upholstered chair, shaking her head with that expression Marcus had known since childhood, a mixture of unconditional love and deep disappointment. "Marcus, dear," she said with that maternal authority only she possessed, "your grandfather built this empire with his own hands. He understood the value of things because he felt their weight, knew the sweat they cost. You only understand the price. Business is numbers, Grandma. Sentimentality breaks companies." Marcus pocketed his phone, adjusting the cuffs of his Egyptian linen shirt. "That's how the world works. And coldness breaks souls," she murmured. But he had already been distracted by another message about oil price fluctuations. Marcus looked at the woman who had been his only emotional constant. At 83, Catherine maintained the elegant posture of someone who had built an empire alongside her husband, but lately there was something different. Small lapses, almost imperceptible hesitations that he attributed to the natural fatigue of age. "All women are the same," he muttered to himself, remembering the endless parade of beautiful faces and calculated smiles that populated his social life in New York, Paris, London. Always agreeing, always available, always empty. "Stop sighing like a rejected teenager," Catherine said, standing, with the determination that had always characterized her. "Let's explore Rome, and maybe you'll find something or someone that awakens your sleeping soul." Marcus smiled, that automatic smile he used to reassure nervous investors, but had no idea that in a few hours his life would be completely rewritten by a woman who saw the world in a way he had never imagined possible. The accident happened in the blink of an eye, with the sudden brutality that characterizes moments that divide life into before and after. Catherine was walking along Via del Corso, admiring shop windows that looked like open-air art galleries, when she decided to cross the bike lane to photograph a Baroque fountain on the other side of the street. In recent months, her hands had developed an almost imperceptible tremor, something the family attributed to the natural fatigue of age, to years of responsibilities that weighed on shoulders that had once been invincible. But in that fateful moment, something more subtle betrayed her. Catherine misjudged the speed of the bicycle approaching in the bike lane. For a fraction of a second, her body hesitated, an almost imperceptible stiffness in her muscles, as if her reflexes had lost perfect synchronization with her thoughts. The timing that had always been her ally abandoned her at the most crucial moment. The cyclist, trying to swerve, hit her laterally with an impact that echoed through the square, like a gunshot. "Signora, Madonna mia, aiuto!" The desperate cry of the young cyclist cut through the air as Marcus ran, his Italian leather shoes slipping on the wet cobblestones, his heart hammering against his ribs like a panicked bird. 3 hours later, at Ospedale Fattebene Fratelli, the doctors reassured the family with the bureaucratic efficiency of professionals accustomed to tragedies. Catherine was fine, miraculously only bruises and considerable shock, but would need observation and absolute rest for a few hours. Marcus found himself in a waiting room that seemed to have been decorated in the 1980s and abandoned there, his $2,000 suit contrasting brutally with the blue plastic chairs and the persistent smell of disinfectant that couldn't completely mask the underlying odor of human anxiety. While waiting, his mind worked as it always had, calculating financial solutions to emotional problems. The best neurologist in Rome would cost €5,000 per consultation, maybe 10,000 for immediate VIP care. He could sue the cyclist, of course, but that would take time and energy. Better to invest in first-class treatment and forget the rest. Money solves everything, he thought, adjusting the Rolex Submariner that had belonged to his grandfather. That's how it had always worked in his perfectly organized life. Problem, expensive solution. Problem solved. Simple, efficient, predictable. He observed the daily ballet of human vulnerability around him. Anxious families whispering prayers in Italian, hurried nurses navigating between gurneys and worries. The universal drama of fragility that money can't completely eliminate. He had no idea that a woman with a vintage hat and eyes that saw beyond the visible was about to teach him that there are things money cannot buy, detect, or cure. That's when she appeared. First came the hat, a navy blue cloche from the 1960s that seemed to have been transported directly from an Audrey Hepburn film to that charmless hospital corridor. The velvet ribbon was perfectly aligned, not a thread out of place, as if it were a work of art using the years only to gain character. Then the posture, spine straight as a principal ballerina at Teatro alla Scala, chin slightly raised at an angle that suggested both confidence and vulnerability, like a classical sculpture that had come to life and decided to walk among mortals. The tweed dress she wore made Marcus blink twice, immediately activating his radar trained to recognize quality. It was clearly vintage haute couture, not one of the cheap imitations he had seen in elegant Manhattan thrift stores, but a genuine piece that breathed decades of meticulous care. There was a quality in the fabric that only real money, invested with love and patience over time, can preserve. But it was something beyond the clothes that hypnotized him in a way he couldn't categorize. The way she moved, as if she were dancing an invisible waltz with the space around her, as if she knew secrets of the world's geometry that were hidden from common eyes. Marcus applied his usual social reading technique, developed through years of high-stakes negotiations. Expensive vintage dress plus aristocratic posture equals eccentric heiress or nouveau riche, trying to impress with purchased authenticity. Hands without flashy jewelry equals either too rich to show off or carefully economical by necessity. He decided to find out which of the two. He activated his predatory seducer instincts, approaching with the smile that had conquered heiresses on 3 continents and melted resistance in boardrooms from Tokyo to London. "Forgive me for interrupting your wait," he said with his deep and studiedly charming voice, that tone that had been calibrated through years of practice to be irresistible. "But I rarely see someone who appreciates true classical elegance with such authenticity." The woman turned her face in his direction, but not exactly in his direction, Marcus noted with growing curiosity. Slightly to the side, as if she were listening to something in the air that he couldn't detect, as if there were a parallel conversation happening on a frequency his ears couldn't pick up. When she smiled, there was a quality in the smile that completely disarmed him, not the reaction he expected, nor was prepared to process. It wasn't the dazzlement he usually received, nor calculated shyness, nor even sophisticated indifference. It was something different, something that seemed pitying, understanding. "Very kind of you," she replied with a melodious voice that carried refined Italian accent, but there were layers in that voice he couldn't decipher. "Although I must confess that my choice of style has more to do with the quality of touch than with appearance." Marcus felt his usual seduction circuits fail for the first time in years. His practiced lines seemed to ricochet off her like bullets off invisible armor. She responded politely, but there was a depth in her words that suggested she was participating in a completely different game than he thought he was playing. "Interesting," he murmured to himself, doubling down. "One who doesn't bite the bait immediately. Even more interesting." Before he could reformulate his approach, the double doors opened with the metallic sound characteristic of hospitals, and Catherine appeared in a wheelchair, pushed by a nurse who seemed to have seen all possible human tragedies and developed a gentle efficiency to deal with them. Her eyes lit up seeing her grandson, that special brightness she reserved only for him, then fixed on the woman beside him with a curiosity Marcus recognized as dangerous. It was the look Catherine used when she was about to emotionally adopt someone. "Marcus, this place reminds me of the field hospitals I visited in Korea when your grandfather was in military service. The same mixture of hope and despair in the air." her eyes, still sharp despite age and recent shock, fixed on the woman. "And who is this charming young lady you managed to enchant in a hospital of all places?" What happened next deeply intrigued Marcus and activated all his trained observation instincts. His grandmother addressed the stranger with a naturalness that suggested instant recognition between equals, that inexplicable chemistry that happens when two people of true class meet, regardless of circumstances. When Catherine extended her hand, the woman accepted it with a delicacy that seemed almost ritualistic, holding it for a few seconds longer than socially necessary, as if she were, Marcus frowned, as if she were analyzing something through that prolonged touch, studying, diagnosing. "It's an immense pleasure, Mrs. Sterling," the woman said, and Marcus noticed something peculiar in the way she held his grandmother's hand, not just polite courtesy, but intense concentration, as if she were reading a book through touch. When the family was called to sign the endless discharge papers, Marcus quickly withdrew a business card from his Italian leather wallet, the paper still carrying the subtle aroma of his Tom Ford cologne mixed with the characteristic smell of new money, that mixture of special ink and high-weight paper that only very expensive cards possess. "I would immensely like to continue our conversation," he said, pressing the card into her hands with the confidence of someone who had never been rejected. "Perhaps you could allow me to thank you for your pleasant company with dinner. I know some places in Rome that—" The smile she gave him contained layers he couldn't completely decipher. There was genuine gratitude, yes, but also something that deeply unsettled him. It was the kind of smile that very wise people give to children who have just said something innocently revealing about themselves. It was a smile that seemed to say, "You have no idea what you're asking for, but it's going to be an interesting journey for both of us." That afternoon, alone in her modest but well-kept house in Trastevere, with its exposed brick walls that told stories of centuries and windows framed by geraniums that her mother had planted decades ago, Giulia Benedetti held Marcus's card between her fingers, tracing the raised letters she couldn't completely decipher. The paper still carried the complex aroma of the American man, notes of bergamot and amber from expensive cologne, but also something she had learned to identify over the years as the particular smell of those who handle a lot of money. Special ink from important documents, leather from expensive wallets, even the subtle metallic aroma of coins and bills that had passed through powerful hands. But there was another aroma that haunted her, that had stuck in her memories like smoke on clothes. During the prolonged greeting with the elderly American woman, Giulia had detected something that hit her like a punch to the stomach, the unmistakable odor that had marked the final, painful years of her own grandfather's life. Subtle, musky, slightly earthy, like wet wood in an old basement, but with an underlying chemical note that only someone with her olfactory hypersensitivity could detect in such early stages. "Parkinson," she whispered to the empty air of the room, the word echoing between the walls like a prayer or a curse. The memory involuntarily transported her back to those dark days. Her grandfather, Alessandro, a master craftsman who had spent 60 years carving wood with the precision of a Swiss clockmaker, struggling to hold his tools while his hands, those hands that had once created works of art, betrayed his will with uncontrollable tremors. The sebum overproduction caused by the disease altered the chemistry of his sweat and body oil, creating that specific and terrible aroma that she had learned to hate and fear. But she had also learned to recognize it, months, sometimes up to a year, before the first obvious symptoms manifested. "I can't let it happen again," she murmured to herself, remembering the bitter frustration of having detected the disease in her grandfather long before the doctors, but not being able to convince anyone to take her seriously. A blind girl with an active imagination, they had said. Family stress. This time would be different. This time someone would listen to her. Using her iPhone's voice command, she photographed the card and listened to the robotic description. Marcus Sterling, Senior Investment Advisor, Sterling Holdings, International. Phone +1 212. When she dialed, she knew she would sound like a lunatic. She knew that a rich and powerful man receiving a phone call from an Italian stranger talking about smells and diseases would probably hang up in less than 30 seconds. But she also knew the story of Joy Milne, the retired Scottish nurse who had detected Parkinson's in her husband Les years before the official diagnosis. Scientists had studied her exhaustively and confirmed the impossible. It wasn't madness, it was pure biochemistry. It was science working through an incredibly calibrated human instrument. "Marcus Sterling," answered the deep, controlled voice, with that professional intonation that suggested he was accustomed to receiving important calls from important people. "Signor Sterling, this is Giulia from the hospital today. The woman with the vintage dress," he interrupted her, and immediate interest was evident in the change of tone. "What a pleasant surprise. I didn't expect to receive your call so soon." Giulia took a deep breath, gathering all the courage she had accumulated in 42 years of life in a city that hadn't always been kind to her limitations. "Signor Sterling, I need to tell you something that may sound completely impossible, but it's extremely important about your grandmother." Something in the controlled urgency of her voice, in the way she pronounced the words without the slightest social hesitation, cut through any superficial conversation Marcus might have expected. "I'm listening." "During our greeting at the hospital, I detected a specific odor associated with Mrs. Sterling. It's an aroma that only someone with my particular olfactory sensitivity can perceive in very early stages of development." A calculated pause, then, "Your grandmother may be developing Parkinson's disease." The silence on the other end of the line extended for so long that Giulia began to fear he had hung up or the call had dropped. She could almost hear the gears of his mind working, processing the information, rejecting it, considering it again. "Ma'am," Marcus said finally, his voice having lost all seductive smoothness and been replaced by a cutting intensity she imagined he used in boardrooms when billions were at stake. "With all due respect, are you telling me you have some kind of superpower? Because I must say, there are people who take advantage of families in vulnerable situations, and I have very expensive and very aggressive lawyers." Giulia remained calm, expecting exactly this reaction. "I completely understand your skepticism, Signor Sterling. I would question it myself if I were in your position, but I can be specific. I detected compounds like sebacate and altered fatty acids in your grandmother. These are biomarkers that accompany the sebum overproduction characteristic of developing Parkinson's." "That's..." Marcus stopped, processing. "That's too specific to be a scam attempt. Parkinson's disease causes sebum overproduction in the skin, dramatically altering the chemical composition of sweat and body oil. This creates a subtle but distinct odor, musky, earthy, with chemical notes that most people could never detect. I cared for my own grandfather during the final 5 years of his life and learned to recognize this smell years before motor symptoms became obvious." She took a deep breath before playing her final card. "There's a woman in Scotland, Joy Milne, who discovered this same ability when she detected Parkinson's in her husband. Scientists at the University of Manchester studied her exhaustively. They published papers about it. It's real, Signor Sterling. It's not madness or charlatanism." Marcus felt the known world tilt slightly on its axis. Catherine's subtle hesitation at the moment of the accident, the way her hands sometimes trembled almost imperceptibly when she thought no one was looking. Small timing lapses he had attributed to age. "How can I be sure you're not..." he began but stopped. "What do you have to gain by lying to a complete stranger about this?" "Nothing, except the peace of mind of knowing I warned you. If I'm wrong, you'll have lost a medical consultation. If I'm right, as I was about my grandfather, maybe you still have time for early treatment that can make a significant difference in her quality of life." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He stood on his hotel terrace, watching Rome's lights reflect on the Tiber, while his analytical mind processed information with the same intensity he used to evaluate risky investments. The next morning, he cancelled all tourist commitments and called his private doctor in Manhattan. "Dr. Richards, hypothetical question. Is it possible to diagnose diseases through smell?" A laugh from the other end of the line. "Marcus, you're watching too much Discovery Channel. That's science fiction movie stuff. But hypothetically speaking, well," a long pause, "the kind doctors make when they're about to admit something that challenges their established beliefs. There's an absolutely bizarre case in Scotland. A woman who claimed she could smell Parkinson's. First they thought it was complete charlatanism until, well, she was always right. 100% accuracy. Scientists from important universities still study the case. They're trying to develop tests based on her discoveries. Marcus felt something cold run down his spine like melting ice. 3 days later, when Giulia answered the phone again in her silent house, Marcus's voice was loaded with an emotion she had never heard before in his calculated and controlled words. "You were right," he said simply. "Early-stage Parkinson's confirmed by 3 different neurologists. The doctors said that detecting it so early can make all the difference in the world in terms of treatment and quality of life." Giulia closed her eyes, feeling simultaneously the bitter relief of having been heard and the deep sadness of having her suspicions confirmed. "I'm deeply sorry that my suspicion was confirmed, but I'm genuinely happy that now you can act." "Giulia," his voice softened in a way she didn't expect, losing all business hardness. "I owe you more than I can adequately express. May I see you again to thank you personally? And I confess that you intrigue me more deeply than anyone I've ever met." For the first time in years, Giulia felt her heart race with the genuine prospect of a romantic encounter. But immediately the cruel reality imposed itself like a concrete wall. He didn't know about her blindness. His interest, whatever it was, would evaporate the moment of revelation, as it always happened. "Signor Sterling, Marcus," she corrected herself, liking the way the name sounded on her tongue. "I accept your invitation, but there's something extremely important I need to reveal to you first." "It can be anything, Giulia. After what you did, there's nothing that could—" "Marcus," she interrupted gently, "I am blind." On the morning of their date, Marcus prepared with the same meticulous care he dedicated to the most crucial negotiations of his career. Italian suit tailored in 180 thread fabric, the Rolex Submariner that had belonged to his grandfather, handmade leather shoes from Milan. Every detail was mathematically perfect, every element calculated to impress. But as he looked at himself in the hotel mirror, something strange happened. For the first time in years, he wondered if all that luxury armor really mattered to the woman he was about to meet. He drove to Trastevere through streets that seemed designed for carriages, not modern cars, until he found the address Giulia had provided, a modest but impeccably maintained house, with red geraniums in the windows and a facade that breathed family tradition spanning several generations. When he rang the polished bronze doorbell, the door was opened by a middle-aged man with penetrating, dark eyes that examined him with the intensity of an airport security scanner. Lorenzo Benedetti had the kind of physical presence that suggested he had spent his life working with his hands and wasn't easily impressed by expensive suits. "Lei deve essere Marcus," he said, with a voice that sounded simultaneously like an assessment and a test. "Io sono Lorenzo, padre di Giulia." Marcus immediately activated his international diplomatic mode, extending his hand with the smile that had conquered investors on 4 continents. "It's an honor to meet you, Signor Benedetti. Your daughter was incredibly kind and—" "Papa, don't interrogate the man on the doorstep like he's a thief," came an amused voice from inside the house, loaded with that Italian melody he had begun to associate with mystery and possibilities. Marcus looked up toward the voice and felt the air literally escape from his lungs, as if he had been punched. Giulia descended the stairs in what seemed like cinematic slow motion, her fingers sliding lightly over the dark wood banister polished by time and use. She wore a navy blue dress that Marcus immediately recognized as authentic vintage Dior, not a reproduction, but a genuine piece from the 1950s that had been preserved like a work of art. But it wasn't the clothes that hypnotized him to the point of temporary paralysis. It was her eyes. Open, without the dark glasses she had worn at the hospital, they revealed a blue so intense and deep it seemed to contain entire oceans, storms and calms, all the vastness of the Mediterranean captured in human irises. But there was something in them that left him breathless, a timeless quality, as if they looked through dimensions he couldn't perceive, as if they saw things that were beyond the spectrum of common reality. "Mio Dio," he sighed involuntarily, the phrase escaping his lips before he could censor it. Lorenzo observed the American's reaction with the scientific interest of an entomologist studying a new species. For years he had watched men flee when they discovered Giulia's blindness, some politely with elaborate excuses, others simply disappearing like ghosts. This one at least seemed genuinely enchanted, not just politely interested or morbidly curious. When Giulia reached the bottom of the stairs, Marcus noticed how she moved. not like someone hesitant or insecure, but with a grace that suggested she knew every inch of that space, with an intimacy that went beyond sight. Lorenzo assumed his protective role with the seriousness of a general preparing for battle. "Ragazzo, what is your full name?" "Marcus James Sterling, sir." "Marcus," Lorenzo said, testing the name as if he were evaluating the quality of a wine. "Per favore, take my daughter's hand and escort her to your car." Marcus extended his hand automatically, but confusion began to form in his analytical mind. Why all this formality? Why did she need to be escorted like a medieval princess? Or as if, the moment their fingers touched was literally electric. Giulia's skin was incredibly soft, like silk warmed by the sun, but there was something more. The way she held his hand, not like a woman being romantically courted, but like someone who genuinely needed physical guidance through space. When they took their first step together, the realization hit him like lightning in a clear sky. The elegant posture he had admired at the hospital, the way she always turned her face slightly when speaking, the way she had analyzed the environment through sound and smell, the reference to quality of touch instead of appearance. Lorenzo, observing the exact moment of comprehension in the American's eyes, decided to end any romantic illusion that might still exist. "Take care of my daughter, ragazzo. She sees people's souls, but she doesn't see this physical world." "Papa!" Giulia protested, feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but also with strange anticipation. Marcus stopped mid-step, still holding her hand. For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, his known world wavered on its foundations. All his carefully cultivated seduction strategies, based on physical appearance and visual ostentation, became instantly irrelevant, like cards from a deck someone had thrown to the wind. But then something absolutely extraordinary happened, something that neither Lorenzo nor Giulia expected, based on decades of painful experiences with other men. Instead of the poorly disguised disappointment, embarrassed hesitation, or polite escape that both Lorenzo and Giulia had learned to expect and fear, Marcus felt a powerful and completely unexpected wave of protection, a primitive and visceral need to guard this extraordinary woman from anything in the world that could hurt or diminish her. "Giulia," he said with a voice lower and more genuine than it had been in years, all pretense abandoned like unnecessary clothes. "You saved my grandmother's life. Allow me to take care of you today." Marcus took her to Armando al Pantheon, a restaurant he had chosen for its stellar reputation and stratospheric prices that normally guaranteed an unforgettable experience. The maitre d' received them with the reverence reserved for clients clearly capable of paying for the best table in the house. "Signore Sterling, what a pleasure to have you with us. Your preferred table is ready." As they settled at the table overlooking the illuminated Pantheon, Marcus observed Giulia with the fascination of an anthropologist discovering a new civilization. She oriented herself through subtle sounds, the delicate click of plates, the whisper of conversations around them, the rhythm of waiters' steps on polished marble. The sommelier approached with the reverence of a priest presenting a sacred relic, carrying a bottle of 1997 Barolo that cost more than most people's monthly salary. "An exceptional choice, signore. A truly historic vintage." Marcus smiled with the satisfaction of someone accustomed to impressing through price. When the wine was served, he watched Giulia taste it delicately, waiting for the automatic approval he always received. Instead, she paused, frowning slightly. "It's a magnificent wine," she said diplomatically, "but it's approximately 2 degrees too cold. The cherry notes are completely dormant and I can detect a slight cork taste that you may not have noticed." The sommelier visibly paled, checked the temperature with a discreet thermometer, and ran to change the bottle. He returned minutes later with profuse apologies and a new bottle served at the exact temperature. Marcus watched the small drama unfold with a mixture of fascination and growing discomfort. "How did you manage to force training by necessity?" she replied with a smile that contained layers of experience he was just beginning to suspect, and perhaps a bit of natural gift. As the dishes arrived, each one a visual work of art that cost a small fortune, Marcus watched Giulia taste each bite with growing diplomacy that he was learning to recognize as a sign of trouble. "Is everything all right?" he finally asked, seeing her delicately poke at the risotto without the enthusiasm he expected. "It's adequate," she tried, polite as always, But there was a quality in her voice he was learning to decode. Marcus had spent years learning to read people in high-stakes negotiations, and something in her body language screamed polite dissatisfaction. "Giulia, please, be completely honest." "With me, what's wrong?" She hesitated, clearly debating internally between politeness and honesty. "Do you really want to know the truth?" "Absolutely. No filters." What followed was a systematic and devastatingly precise demolition that left Marcus simultaneously humiliated and completely fascinated. "The risotto," Giulia began with the precision of a trained gastronomic critic, "was prepared in a pan that absorbed flavors from a previous dish, probably something with garlic and anchovies. The rice itself is perfectly cooked, but the base was contaminated with flavors that don't belong here." Marcus listened in growing silence. "The lamb is approximately 2 minutes overcooked due to carelessness in timing. I can feel that the fibers are slightly tougher than they should be. The wine reduction sauce was caramelized a bit too much, creating an underlying bitter note." She continued with the relentless efficiency of an auditor discovering accounting fraud. "The wine, even corrected, was poorly preserved. I can detect signs of oxidation that indicate the bottle wasn't stored properly, and She paused. "I can hear from our waiter's breathing that he's impatient and irritated, probably because we're occupying a table he wanted for clients who tip better." Marcus sat in stunned silence. "The ambience," she concluded, "tries to compensate with visual ostentation for what it lacks in genuine quality. It's like an out-of-tune orchestra trying to impress with volume instead of harmony." For a moment that seemed to last a geological era, Marcus didn't know how to react. Then he began to laugh, a genuine and uncontrolled guffaw that drew curious looks from nearby tables and made the impatient waiter nervously move away. "Giulia," he said when he managed to stop laughing, "you just completely destroyed my elaborate attempt to impress, and somehow that's the most attractive thing anyone has ever done in my presence." "How so?" she asked, genuinely confused. "You perceive truth in places where I didn't even know falseness could exist. It's as if you possess a superpower for detecting authenticity that goes far beyond normal vision." On the way back home, after a dessert that Giulia gently described as artistically ambitious but technically flawed, she made a proposal that would change everything. "Marcus, if you want to really know me, not the romanticized version you've created in your mind, but who I really am, you need to come with me to a place tomorrow. But there's one non-negotiable condition." "What?" "Leave all your ostentation at home, all of it. No $20,000 watch, no suit that costs more than a car, no black credit card. Buy simple clothes, jeans, cotton shirt, ordinary shoes. Just you, Marcus Sterling the man, not Marcus Sterling the investment portfolio." "Is it a test?" he asked, but was smiling. "It's an opportunity to meet a version of yourself that maybe you've forgotten existed." The next day, at 5 in the morning, Marcus rang the doorbell wearing jeans he had bought at a regular store and a simple cotton shirt that cost less than his normal ties. He felt strangely naked without his usual status symbols, but also curiously liberated, as if he had removed armor he didn't know he was wearing. Giulia took him on a journey through Rome he had never experienced, not the Rome of 5-star hotels and starred restaurants, but the Rome of the senses, of local markets, of places where the city's true life pulsed. At Mercato, Testaccio, a sensory labyrinth of exotic spices, aged cheeses and fresh produce that seemed to have been harvested that very morning, Giulia stopped at a spice stand that seemed to contain aromatic treasures from around the world. "Close your eyes," she instructed, with gentle authority he was learning to respect. "What?" "Trust me completely. Close your eyes and tell me what you feel, not what you see." Marcus obeyed, initially uncomfortable with the vulnerability of being blind in a crowd of strangers. Giulia took his hand and guided it over different spices with the precision of a teacher teaching a new language. "This is true Ceylon cinnamon," she explained, guiding his fingers over the aromatic bark. "Notice how it's sweet and delicate, completely different from the common cassia you know from American supermarkets. Breathe deeply. Do you feel the difference?" Marcus tried but failed miserably at detecting the nuances that for her were obviously distinct as primary colors. "This is genuine cardamom," she continued, "harvested in the mountains of Guatemala. And this," she guided his hand to another container, is real cashmere saffron, 3 stigmas per flower, hand-picked. As they passed through different stalls, Marcus's sensory education continued with humiliatingly poor results. He confused basil with oregano, was unable to distinguish between different types of olive oil, couldn't identify cheeses by smell or texture. At the cheese stand, Giulia guided his hand over aged pecorino. Feel the slightly granular texture. That indicates at least 18 months of careful aging. And this aroma of toasted nuts mixed with lanolin? Sheep's cheese from the mountains, where the animals graze on wild herbs. At the olive oil stand, she made him taste 2 distinct types. This one is spicy and assertive, harvested early when the olives were still green and hard. This other one is sweeter and smoother, from a late harvest when the olives had fully ripened. Marcus systematically failed each test, his life of privilege having apparently atrophied senses that she had developed by necessity. "I'm absolutely terrible at this," he finally admitted, opening his eyes with a mixture of frustration and admiration. "You're not terrible," Giulia smiled with patience he didn't know he deserved. "You're just learning for the first time. You've spent your whole life looking at things, buying them, owning them. I feel them, live them, connect with them. Your perception is asleep, not dead." It was at the last stall, where an artisan sold honey from different regions of Italy, that the turning point happened. "Close your eyes again," Giulia asked softly. "Giulia, I've already proven I'm a complete disaster at... Trust me, this time is different." Marcus reluctantly obeyed. Giulia dipped a small wooden stick in honey and brought it close to his nose. "Don't try to analyze or categorize. Just feel. Let the memories come." Marcus inhaled and suddenly was transported. The sweet floral aroma instantly took him back to childhood, to his grandmother Catherine's kitchen when she made honey cookies on winter Sundays. He could almost hear her laughter, feel the warmth from the oven, the absolute security of those moments before the world became complicated. "This is..." his voice failed. "Acacia honey," Giulia said softly. "Harvested in the hills of Tuscany where bees visit the same flowers their ancestors visited for centuries. It's not just honey, Marcus. It's liquid memory, preserved tradition, crystallized love." When he opened his eyes, there were unshed tears glistening there. "This is how I see the world," she explained, gently touching his arm. "Not through eyes, but through connection, memory, emotion. Every smell tells a story. Every flavor carries a lifetime of experiences." In that moment, Marcus understood that he was in the presence of someone who had developed real superpowers through adversity, and that his own life of privilege and ease had left him sensorially dulled, emotionally disconnected from all the richness of the world that existed beyond what money could buy. "You made me feel more in these last few minutes," he said, "than I've felt in years of expensive experiences." That evening, sitting on the terrace of Giulia's house under a starry sky that she perceived through the changing temperature on her skin and the nighttime sounds of Rome settling into sleep, Marcus made a confession that surprised him with its brutal honesty. "Giulia, my entire adult life, I've been trying to figure out if women want me for who I am or for what I have. With you, for the first time, I genuinely want to be loved for who I am, whoever that is underneath all this equipment." "And what are you, Marcus Sterling, when you remove all the golden armor?" she asked, tilting her face toward him in the way he had learned to love. He thought for a long moment, listening to the cicadas sing their eternal song and smelling the night jasmine that she had taught him to identify and appreciate. "A man who wants to protect and be protected," he said finally, "who wants to build something real and lasting instead of just accumulating impressive things, who wants to learn to see the world through your other senses, who wants to be necessary to someone for reasons that have nothing to do with money." When they kissed for the first time, it was with the taste of fresh figs on their lips and the perfume of Italian earth enveloping them like an ancestral blessing. But it was 3 days later that Marcus had the idea that would change both their lives forever. "Giulia," he said over the phone, his voice loaded with an excitement she had never heard before, "do you remember Joy Milne you mentioned? I've spent the last few days obsessively researching her. There's an entire field of olfactory diagnostic research that's dramatically underfunded. What if we created something together?" "How so?" she asked, intrigued by the intensity in his voice. "A research institute. Not charity, not condescending philanthropy. A real and genuine partnership. Your perception and knowledge are more valuable than any artwork in any museum in the world. I want to invest in your vision so the whole world learns to see like you see." The proposal he outlined in the following days was ambitious to the point of audacity: the Benedetti Sterling Institute for Sensory Research. Marcus would provide the financial resources, international connections, and business infrastructure. Giulia would provide the sensory expertise, practical knowledge, and scientific guidance. Together, they would work with researchers from prestigious universities to develop early diagnostic protocols based on olfactory biomarkers, not just for Parkinson's, but potentially for a wide range of medical conditions. "You have an ability that science is just beginning to understand and validate," Marcus explained during a meeting with lawyers and scientific consultants he had convened. "We want to document this ability, study it, and see if it can be taught or at least technologically reproduced." "But Marcus," Giulia protested during one of their long planning conversations, "this is a beautiful dream, but what if I'm wrong about other things? What if what I sensed about your grandmother was just an extraordinary coincidence?" "Giulia," he took her hands with a tenderness she had never expected from a man so accustomed to power. "You saved my grandmother's life with something the best neurologists in Rome couldn't detect. If there's a 1 in a million chance that your ability could help other families detect diseases years before symptoms appear, isn't it worth investigating? Isn't it worth trying?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've spent my whole life investing in things with a 1% chance of return, investing in you, in your perception, in your knowledge. This is the safest and most important bet I've ever made in my entire career." The final confrontation with Lorenzo, Giulia's father, happened one evening when Marcus was invited for a family dinner. After the meal, Lorenzo called him for a serious conversation in the small garden behind the house. "Ragazzo, I'm going to be completely direct with you," Lorenzo began, lighting a cigarette his wife didn't know he still smoked occasionally. "Do you want to know how many men have already hurt my daughter? Not because they're necessarily bad, but because they see her as an exotic trophy, an interesting curiosity. The blind girlfriend of the American millionaire. What a fascinating story to tell friends at exclusive clubs, right?" Marcus swallowed hard but maintained eye contact. "She's worth more than all your investments combined, all your properties, all the numbers in all your bank accounts," Lorenzo continued, with an intensity that made Marcus understand exactly where. Giulia had inherited her inner strength. "If you treat her like one of your expensive toys, if you discard her when the novelty wears off, or when some social situation becomes inconvenient, I will find you. It doesn't matter how many lawyers or bodyguards you have, it doesn't matter what country you hide in." Marcus nodded solemnly. "Signor Benedetti, I completely understand your concerns and—" "Do you understand?" Lorenzo interrupted him. "Do you really? Because she's more complete, more capable, more genuinely intelligent than any of us. Can you really comprehend that? That you're the lucky one in this situation?" Marcus thought for a long moment before responding. "Yes, I understand. And you're right. I'm extraordinarily lucky. I intend to spend the rest of my life deserving this luck." 18 months later, Marcus's office in Manhattan had been so completely transformed that visitors frequently asked if they had entered the wrong place. Where once there had been only framed certificates and corporate awards, now aromatic plants in Italian terracotta pots filled the environment with fragrances that changed with the seasons. Photographs of the Benedetti Sterling Institute in Rome occupied places of honor on the walls, alongside published scientific articles about olfactory research and letters of gratitude from families who had benefited from early detection programs. Catherine, whose early Parkinson's treatment had significantly stabilized symptoms and dramatically improved her quality of life, held a cup of herbal tea that Giulia had formulated specifically for her, a blend of natural ingredients that helped with muscle stiffness and anxiety that sometimes accompanied the condition. "This tea," the matriarch said with genuine admiration, "not only tastes wonderful, I can literally feel how it calms my muscles and clears my thoughts." Giulia smiled, adjusting a new aromatic mixture she was developing. She had taught Marcus aromatherapy techniques that alleviated not only Catherine's physical symptoms, but also provided a form of intimate and connected care that money could never buy. The Institute was making international headlines. The research team had achieved significant progress in developing an electronic nose capable of detecting Parkinson's biomarkers years before the first physical symptoms, all based on Giulia's knowledge and other people with hyperosmia who had been identified around the world. "You know something," Marcus said, embracing Giulia as they watched the frenetic movement of Manhattan through the panoramic window. "I used to think success meant having everything I wanted. Now I've discovered it means genuinely wanting everything I have." On the glass coffee table, side by side, lay 2 wedding rings that Marcus had commissioned from an artisan jeweler in Rome. Simple, elegant, with small tactile reliefs that Giulia could feel and interpret with her fingers. Inside each one, engraved in almost invisible Braille, was written, "Verum amor non indige oculis." True love doesn't need eyes. That afternoon, in a scene that had become a sacred ritual between them, Marcus sat beside Catherine, who dozed peacefully in a comfortable chair near the window. He massaged her hands with an essential oil that Giulia had prepared specifically to stimulate circulation and relieve stiffness, not uncomfortable with her vulnerability, but completely present, connected. He had learned that true care wasn't solving problems by throwing money at them, but being genuinely present in pain, in joy, in the complete complexity of human experience. Giulia approached silently, and Marcus extended his hand without looking, knowing exactly where she was by the characteristic sound of her steps and the subtle aroma of lavender she wore, not because it was expensive or impressive, but because it connected her with precious memories of her own grandmother. "What did you learn today?" she asked, a question that had become a ritual between them, a way to mark daily growth, the small discoveries that constitute a genuinely lived life. "That I spent 32 years looking at the world," Marcus replied, closing his eyes and smiling. "But I'm only now beginning to truly see it." Catherine, in a moment of clarity that had become more frequent with treatment, opened her eyes and held both Marcus's and Giulia's hands simultaneously. "You know," she said with that wisdom that only people who have lived completely can possess, "I prayed for years for a woman of substance for my grandson. God sent me an angel who doesn't need eyes to see the deepest truth about people." Marcus smiled, his gaze moving to a framed letter on the wall, from a family in Chicago thanking them for an early Parkinson's diagnosis that had saved years of quality of life for their father. The institute was already changing lives around the world, one family at a time. "Grandma," Marcus said, gently kissing Catherine's forehead, "you always knew, didn't you, that I needed to learn to stop looking and start feeling?" "Dear," Catherine smiled with that unconditional love that had been his constant throughout his life. "Sometimes the greatest wisdom is recognizing when we know absolutely nothing. Giulia taught me that too." The final narration echoed through the silent room. Marcus Sterling thought he was going to teach a woman about luxury and sophistication, but a blind woman taught him to see for the first time in his life. Because sometimes true vision has absolutely nothing to do with eyes. It has everything to do with the courage to open your heart. Sometimes the greatest wealth isn't in having perfect eyes, but in developing the vision of the heart. And once we learn to truly see beyond appearances, we discover treasures that were hidden right in front of us all along. As Giulia taught us, there are ways of seeing that go far beyond physical vision. There are people around us with extraordinary gifts that go completely unnoticed because we judge only by what's on the surface. But stories like this only transform lives when they're shared, when they reach that person who needs to stop underestimating others, or underestimating themselves. Who here has ever judged someone by appearance and then discovered they were completely wrong? That person you thought would be difficult, but who became special in your life? Tell us in the comments. Everyone has a story of when first impressions deceived. Give. Hit a like if you believe we should look beyond appearances, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of what really matters. You see more than you imagine.